Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Nugget Climbing Podcast. Welcome back to Fundamentals Season 2. Now that you've learned how to climb on a training board, train on a spray wall, lift some weights, and do 6 different types of finger training, you're probably injured. Welcome to the injury episode. We really hope that's not true. We did our best to try to give helpful advice that hopefully isn't going to get you guys injured. But today we are diving into how to recover from injuries. Injuries, unfortunately, are a part of rock climbing, and they can really catch you off guard if you've never considered what it would be like to get an injury and if you've never been through that before. So hopefully this is helpful and gets you back on track. I've got a question for you, Jesse. I'm joined, of course, today by Jesse Firestone.
Howdy.
Hello, Jesse. Icebreaker. Have you had any injuries that you were really worried you wouldn't come back from?
Oh, damn. Oh, yeah. Okay. This touches on a lot of stuff that I have to say today. Actually, I was going to talk about this later, but I kind of went through like a pretty existential phase just with the little injury that I had over the last couple months, because it was like I injured my QL, my quadratus lumborum, which is like a kind of big muscle that goes diagonally across your back. And it was just a sprain. It wasn't like a serious injury, but because I injured it, everything was just wonky in my back. So I was having all kinds of like lower back pain and crazy muscle spasms and like nerve pain and stuff. And I was like having a hard time like walking and doing daily chores.
Improving my posture hearing you say this. Sitting up a little straighter.
Well, I didn't injure myself.
Get some more lumbar support.
Injure myself by not having good posture. So I think you're okay. But yeah, like those periods of like, really feeling pain and like not having your normal lifestyle is quite difficult, obviously. And you're like, whoa, I can't even like stand up long enough to do the dishes. How am I going to get back to like climbing double-digit boulders or whatever?
Yeah.
And then the body does its thing. It adapts.
It's amazing.
Heals. It's so incredible. And it's also incredible in a very different way that every single time I get injured, I go through some version of that to more or less existential degree, The lower back was like pretty gnarly. My neck injury was like pretty gnarly. Most of the rest of them, it's like, I try to keep climbing as much as I can, and then I get less of that because I'm just going out and doing something. So it's easier to see yourself getting back there.
Right.
Yeah. But no, that was a scary one. What about you? Have you had an injury that did that?
Yeah, I've had 3, and I'm going to briefly talk about them because I think I'm going to reference back to them as I go through my tips today. But yeah, the first one was my first real pulley injury.
Mm-hmm.
That was 2017 in the spring, and that was the first time I like really had a 6-month journey from like injury to full recovery. So yeah, that one, and that was my first real big climbing injury, so that one really fucked me up. But I learned a lot from it. And then I had a really severe tendonitis or tendinosis in both elbows in 2019 and had to take the whole summer off. And that was interesting because I really felt like I don't know if I still love climbing. Like after that, that was kind of
every session ends in pain.
Yeah, I'll kind of expand on it later, but yeah, exactly. That one really was where I questioned my identity as a climber going through the injury process. And then, I had a bicep tendon partial tear, like a grade 2 tear 2 winters ago. And that was a pretty serious one as well. And what's really cool, I think, like what I want to make sure that people come away with today is that that's a really normal feeling. Like I was, especially with the first pulley injury, it was really hard to find examples of people who had been through that, who were passionate about hard climbing and hard crimping and had gotten back to really hard crimping after the injury.
It's so crazy how much more content there is on that now than there was, what was that, 6 years ago, 5 years ago?
7 years ago.
7 years ago?
Yeah.
There's like whole podcasts now. I think you did a whole podcast on it now, on like how to recover from a pulley injury.
Fingers, yeah. I don't know if I've done a pulley specific one. Probably should.
Okay.
But yeah, there definitely have been. And yeah, there's just so many more examples now, but there literally weren't any. And it was just hard to believe that it was going to be okay.
Even though it's totally like pedestrian.
Yeah, totally. Almost every climber I know has been through it. But yeah, so I guess the takeaway for me is that I've made full recoveries from all of them. And I'm in this training phase now And I'm just a few weeks into it. I just started climbing on a board for the first time again in years. So kind of slowly working my way up. But I think, like, based on how I feel now and how my climbing was going before I started training, assuming all goes well, I think I'll be in the best shape of my life in a few months, like at the end of this training cycle. I can really easily see myself like breaking into new ground, and I think I'm climbing at my very best. So,
dude, rad.
Yeah, that's just
this is going to be a rosy podcast.
I hope so. Yeah. Injuries suck, but you will get better. So, yeah, I think you should kick things off. I looked at your tips and tried to complement them again today.
Cool. Yeah. Before we get into tips, I have a couple quick caveats that I wanted to get out of the way, which are, first of all, you and I are not medical professionals or doctors of any kind. So this is not how to do rehab for any specific sort of injury. I don't know your tips and pitfalls, but I think this is more like philosophically and psychologically how to deal with being a climber who has an injury. That's probably like more the...
Yeah. I focused more on the emotional side,
right?
After reading through your tips. And I do have I'll share what I did for my pulley rehab, because I think it's relevant context and might be helpful for someone. But yeah, just what I did and what helped for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah. The other caveat I had is the podcast is not titled How to Avoid Injuries or How to Not Get Injured. And I think that sort of forms the bedrock for a lot of my philosophical understanding of injuries. Almost you could even go simpler and just say shit happens. Like, I'm probably going to talk about this a lot today, but I'm kind of a tryhard. Like, I really push my body to the limits of what it can do, often beyond the limits of what it can do. And when that happens, you push your tissue capacity past what it can tolerate, you get injured. So it is, if you're someone who likes to perform as hard as you can and try to do these amazing objectives, then you're going to deal with that. It is an inevitability. And focusing your effort, I think, on a lot of the stuff that we talk about today, like being prepared to recover from an injury and thinking about yourself as being someone who's resilient and can adapt and overcome an injury, is probably way more important than worrying about being bulletproof or being more injury resistant or avoiding risk, which are things that I talk about with people pretty often. I think just taking a more capital S stoic viewpoint of it and just sort of accepting that it's going to happen eventually and it's all about how you deal with it is probably more valuable. I'm not saying you should go out and like take a ton of risk, by the way.
I like that. I think it's important to, do the low hanging fruit when it comes to building robustness and preventing injuries. But I've definitely seen people who just are kind of in a constant state of fear and like really avoid pushing themselves in their climbing because of what could happen. And it's like, man, I don't want to live my life like that. I want to try really fucking hard and try to do things. And yeah, things have happened as a result of that, but I've learned from all of them and I make smarter decisions, hopefully, now than I used to because of them. And I've made full recoveries from all of them and they've been okay. They've taught me things.
The longer the career is, the more of them you're going to have and you're going to get good at being injured. Even though I just said a minute ago that I was a little existential with my lower back injury, and I was, but while I was being existential with it, I was also like doing everything I could. On those days when I like couldn't get out of bed, maybe I wasn't doing anything, but the next day, if I felt even a little bit better, I was doing planks or like whatever I could tolerate. You know what I mean? I was training something. And that's that like immune system that I've built up over time, like kicking in and protecting me from the sickness of the mind that you get when you're injured,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm still just kind of riffing, but I've had a few injuries where there were warning signs, like retrospectively, but almost all my injuries just came out of left field.
Yeah.
All my worst injuries were just like I was doing something totally different and some structure got injured that I just would not have even guessed was a problem.
Totally. Yeah, mine have been a little bit more preventable, but that's like with hindsight, like in hindsight, it's like, okay, I can absolutely see what was building and how that happened. And that was kind of stupid, but it wasn't that stupid. Like I wasn't just like blindly ignoring red flags.
I think the question is, if you hadn't gotten injured, would you still reflect on it and think it was stupid?
Yeah, exactly.
And like, almost unilaterally, no. You wouldn't even think of it. It would just be another climbing session.
Right.
Or maybe a great climbing session because you would have sent if you hadn't gotten injured.
Right.
Which is kind of funny how it really colors our hindsight a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. My first tip is when you do get injured, and this could be a traumatic or a chronic injury, but as soon as you're injured and you know you're injured, see the most experienced climbing specific professional that you can see, that you can afford as soon as possible. There's a lot of people out there now who fit that bill. Obviously, like staying local and working with somebody who your insurance works with, if you're American, is beneficial. But there's also a lot of remote people who you can work with online. Like you can work with some of the best people in the world online, which is a huge benefit that we have now. Because seeing somebody who works with climbers, I think you're going to get a plan and you're going to get a diagnosis that probably makes a lot more sense than if you go see, your general care physician who mostly like helps kids that have influenza or whatever.
Right. I was actually going to ask you, having read that, have you ever gone to a regular doctor for any of your injuries?
Oh yeah.
Because that's what like the specialist always tells you to start with that, right? Just to like cover their ass. But that's mostly to do with, and like I have to say, like you should probably do that because we all have to cover our asses as far as insurance and liability and things like that. But I personally have never gotten any helpful advice of any kind ever from a primary care physician. I've had
a mixed bag, and I think the more I've gotten educated about my own anatomy and about the injuries, because I help so many other climbers now that I've just become familiar with a lot of stuff. So like when I hurt my wrist, I immediately knew what it was. I immediately knew like the major risk factors. I went on PubMed. I read everything I could read about TFCC tears and what the risks were and like what the chances were that I would need surgery. And this is kind of a sub tip with going to see a doctor. Just be persistent and take complete control of your future. Like, do not assume that your doctor is out there looking at your chart and working on what the next best thing is for you. Like,
they're way too busy to do that.
Exactly. They see so many patients a day. So what I did was when I hurt my wrist, like we were about to leave for France in like a month, and I knew that I wanted to get an MRI to see what kind of tear it was so that I knew if I needed to worry about getting surgery or not. And I just hounded my doctor. I was like, here's the reports I found on PubMed that look at TFCC injuries and which ones need surgery. I really would like to get an MRI. How can I get in sooner? And I like wound up getting a cancellation and getting in to get an MRI, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 days after I injured it or something, like really soon. And if I hadn't kept following up with messages and supporting myself and like giving evidence to show what I thought, and I actually, when I finally met with my doctor in person, I like apologized to him, and he was like, yeah, he's like a really nice guy, but he was basically like, no, it's like amazing to work with a patient who shows up for themselves and like, and tries, and that's part of why I did what I did to like help you get what you needed.
Yeah.
So if you are going to go that route, if you've had trauma, there are things you probably want to rule out. You want to deal with broken bones. You want to rule out surgery, all that kind of stuff. And the conventional medical system is definitely the right path for that, but you have to be your own advocate. You can't expect that anybody's going to do anything for you.
I love that. Yeah. Fully on the same page.
Yeah. And if it's not serious and there's no broken bones and no nerve pain and you're not like coughing up blood or anything like that, then go see somebody online who's seen 10,000 climbers and they're going to know what you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Nice. That's it? That's your first one?
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, the people who have actually helped me are like Esther Smith from like a podcast years ago on pulley injuries. I think that was on Training Beta. And then like Mark DeJohn, who I've had a podcast with. He's like a active release technique guy who helped me cure my carpal tunnel when like the doctor said you have to get surgery, And then Matt Heiliger with the bicep thing. Like he was so helpful, and that was all remote with him.
Yeah.
So
there are things that you need surgery for, and I'm
for sure.
I'm just some idiot on a podcast, so don't take my word for too much here. But I think like the majority of the time, you probably don't need surgery. Like,
yeah, and that's like, again, going back to being your own advocate, like do some digging on that because things are changing quickly.
Yeah.
And an old school physician might still want to send you to a surgeon when all of the latest research is saying don't do surgery on this. Like you can get better results from rehab.
Yeah, not to hammer it too hard, but the person who's most likely to know whether surgery actually makes sense for you as a climber or not is going to be that rehab professional who works in the climbing space.
Yeah.
This is like the big thing is like, if you go see a hand surgeon, their job is to do surgery. So that's the last person you want to see after you've decided that surgery is an option for you and you want to start getting a consult about it. Not the first person you go see, because their job is to look at things and assume that they're going to do surgery. Like I don't think a good one will always do that. And I'm not saying you can't trust those people. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
Should be a last resort, probably.
Right. Yeah. That's great. Okay. My first tip is on the other side of the spectrum, on the emotional side. And my first tip is know that it's going to be okay. And know that you will make a full recovery and get back to climbing harder than you were before. And, there are rare exceptions, but the exception probably isn't you. Like if you're listening to this and you're worried about, am I going to make a recovery? Am I going to get back to the climbing level that I want to be at? You probably can. And the human body is just so resilient. But I think the first step after an injury is to stop and like take a really deep breath and tell yourself, oh my God, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It doesn't feel okay. It sucks. I have no idea how long it's going to take. But yeah, life is very long and life's just going to look a little different than you imagined for the next little bit, but it's going to be okay.
Yeah. I think that's good advice. I think all my biggest injuries changed me in some way, but not as negative as I thought it was going to be when I was like dealing with the worst symptoms of the injury,
Yeah.
Like I'm still aware of a lot of them and they like have maybe changed the way I move or they changed like the way I feel sometimes, but I still climb harder. I still do like lift more weight. I'm still active in all these ways, and not every injury is going to allow you to do that, but you can let it affect you and have equanimity with the effect that it's having on you, and also be like optimistic about it at the same time. Like you can hold those two things at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Next tip. Me?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, this one's a little more fiddly, but I think it's important for climbers to understand the relationship between velocity and volume. So I'm talking about velocity being the speed of the moves you do on the wall and volume being the amount of climbing that you do. So as your average speed of moves goes up, the risk of injury or the intensity on the body goes up, right? And as the volume of climbing goes up, the risk generally, both chronically and traumatically, goes up. So if you jack up both of those things at the same time, you're dramatically increasing your risk of injury. That's just a good thing to know if you're not injured. But if you're coming back from an injury, probably the two variables to pay the most attention to in your climbing are the volume of your climbing sessions and the average speed of the moves that you're making. So like for me, if I have almost any kind of injury, the first climbing session I'm going to have back is going to be like very low speed and it's not going to be a ton of climbing, right? I'm going to lock all the moves. I'm going to move very stably. I'm not like squeezing all my muscles like as hard as I can. I'm just trying to stay stable and like not do anything sudden that might like surprise my body, right? I try to do that on a board just because I've had a home wall and I have like a level of base strength that allows me to go to a board. Like that's a comfort area for me. Whereas like a commercial gym would be like a riskier seeming area to me because the setting's going to be unpredictable. A lot of the moves are going to be like jumpy or dynamic. The walls are like insanely tall nowadays. And probably the second most comfortable place for me is outside, like more technical, easier climbing outside is usually like something that I go to almost immediately after recovering from an injury. That's like a first stop for me. Basically, the velocity to volume relationship lets you modify your climbing safely when you're injured, but it's also a good thing to be aware of, even if you're just like tired or under recovered or jet lagged, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like a smart thing to know about in climbing in order to like keep yourself safe and also a first step to come back from an injury on the wall.
Yeah, it seems like at least in my own experiences recovering from injuries based on what different professionals have advised me to do, it seems like most of the time you're going to want to build back your volume and then start to build back some load, and volume's like the last thing, or sorry, velocity is the last thing that comes back into the picture. Yeah.
And this is like, you can use this advice to tweak your training too. Like if you want to start climbing on a board, I think we talked about this in the board training episode, but like a very low velocity method of like building up volume on the board would be step one. And then you would like add velocity later. And if you already have a very high capacity for climbing and you want to climb on like a moon board, let's say, just understand that might be way higher velocity than the stuff you're used to. So just tweak that volume knob down, do half the session length that you usually would, and you'll probably be a little bit safer, right? It's not a podcast about not getting injured, but I do think that's an important thing to understand because it has let me get back to climbing way faster from almost all my recent injuries.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, my second tip, staying on the emotional side of things, is let yourself experience your emotions. Let yourself experience whatever emotions come up for you after getting an injury. And I want to talk a little bit more about my first pulley injury because I was fucking bummed when that happened. Like, I had just had the best week of climbing of my life, and I was driving home from that with this like ear to ear grin because of what that meant for all my projects at Smith. And like, I was going to climb 514 this year. I was just on cloud 9, and I was so excited about all the possibilities and things to come. And I was in denial. It like took me a really long time to come to peace with the fact that I was injured. And I felt really lame and pathetic for being so bummed because it was just a finger, in air quotes. And like, I was aware of bigger issues in the world and people who had it way harder than I did. And those perspectives, like keeping that broader perspective, can be really helpful, but don't be ashamed of whatever emotions come up for you, and let yourself experience them and acknowledge them, and even say them out loud. Like, tell yourself like, wow, I'm really fucking bummed about this finger injury, and this sucks, and it's really hard. And you know what? I feel those things because I love climbing and I work really hard at it, and I'm afraid of losing that. And this all like means a lot to me. And it's really helpful. Like, it's really beautiful to acknowledge all of that and just kind of let it wash over you and let yourself feel it. And I think it becomes a lot less scary. And also, when you hide it or push it down, that just leaves room for shame to come in. And I really truly think that kind of keeps you at a lower vibration, and it's going to slow down your journey. And if that's a little too woo-woo, it's going to like make the process more miserable, and it's not going to make you better any faster. So just let yourself feel the things.
That's just good advice for life. That's not really injury specific. Like, if you fall off your project, just letting yourself experience those emotions, I think, is also good advice.
Yeah.
Or if you are just like having a bad day at work, or if you send your project, like all of those things, like it's okay to just feel what you're feeling. I mean, I think I know I talk about Stoic philosophy a lot, but that's like one of the most beautiful parts of Stoic philosophy, in my opinion, is that it's like widely perceived as being like tamp everything down, like lowercase s Stoic. Like, they just chose a bad brand, I think, for that philosophy, because now the word means like be very rigid and like don't let anything show on your face.
Don't let yourself feel anything at all.
Right. But that's not what it's about. It's all about just like facing things with equanimity. That word really is the word to describe it, which is what you're talking about. Just being like, yeah, I feel fucking bummed right now, but on we go. Like, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I really was being hard on myself because I always knew that I would get injured someday. And I had like very aspirational ideas about what I would do with that time. I was like, I'm going to get back into guitar. I'm going to like
French.
learn a language. I'm going to like find a new other passion, or like find a way to do good in the world and all these sorts of things. And when I was going through that, I was just like, I just want to be bummed. I'm just like bummed, and I just want to climb again. And I don't feel like doing any of that other shit. Like, that's not gonna fill this void. And I just kind of needed to get through it. And it helped a lot once I finally gave myself permission and just kind of owned the things I was feeling.
Yeah. I think that's important to understand. I agree.
And we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by Revival Climbing Coalition. As many of you know, I recently got a home wall installed at my house in Washington. It's my dream training setup, and Revival makes the adjustable climbing wall that my TB2 is mounted on. My Revival wall is 12 foot by 12 foot, but they make all sizes of boards. They make fixed angle and adjustable boards. Their adjustable boards go from 15 degrees overhanging all the way down to 70 degrees overhanging with the touch of a button. They also make foam landing systems. I got one of their landing systems as well, and I absolutely love it. It's super comfy to fall on, and I never have to worry about missing the pads or twisting my ankle by landing on the edge of a crash pad. I really admire this company. I recorded an episode with David and Tony, the founders, earlier this year, and we talked about how Revival got started and what sets their products apart. The two of them installed my wall in just 2.5 hours. It blew my mind. The design is super elegant. They use a lot of engineered lumber, so their walls are more environmentally friendly than a lot of the other climbing walls I've seen. They look beautiful, and that also allows them to be less expensive than a lot of their competitors, which for homeowners is a huge plus. If you're a gym owner or a home owner and you're in the market for a training board, a home wall, or a landing system, you can learn more about Revival at revivalclimbing.com. Like I said before, they've got fixed angle and adjustable options, all different sizes. They can match any of the training systems out there as far as like the hole patterns in the wall. They're one of the most affordable options on the market, and their quality is really, really good. I am 1000% happy with my board. One more time, that's revivalclimbing.com to learn more. Be sure to reach out to those guys if you have questions. They're super personable and knowledgeable. And if you do reach out, be sure to tell them I sent you. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. I am a huge fan of therapy. It's helped me with having better boundaries around work. It's helped me build a healthy relationship with my girlfriend. It's helped me enjoy my climbing and feel more clear about what I want to do in climbing. Basically, it's a really helpful tool to do better at life. You can talk about anything, whatever you're struggling with or want to get better at. Your therapist is simply there to listen and help you find your own way. I go to therapy twice a month through BetterHelp, and nothing beats sitting down and talking with a professional who is there for no other reason than to listen and help. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge and without any awkwardness. Discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/nugget today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/nugget. And now back to the show.
Okay. My next one is pretty related. It's find ways to keep loading or climbing. So much like you're saying with just letting yourself feel your emotions, I think that is super important. And in order to maintain that connection to your identity that lets you not have to feel so much negative emotion because you're not doing the thing that makes you feel like yourself, I think trying to do as much of the thing that makes you feel like yourself as you can is probably a good strategy. So I can't remember if I've told this story on the podcast. I know I talked about my wrist injury on the podcast at some point. I tore my TFCC spring 2023. Not the worst TFCC tear. I think time to like full rehab was like maybe 8 months, and I still have like some issues with it on underclings and stuff like that.
And you didn't end up getting surgery, right?
Did not get surgery. No,
Okay.
it's still a possibility because it's just cartilage basically. So the chance of like re-injuring it is not zero. Yeah. So when I hurt my wrist, I think I moped around. I got that MRI, and then I just went on a tear of climbing slabs because I knew that if I did something where I could put a lot more weight in my feet, it wouldn't really matter if I couldn't like pull super hard through my wrist, you know, and maybe even if there were holds, like I could bias towards my left arm. And I started with like V0 slabs that I knew were fun, kind of jaunts, you know, and then I moved up to like the V1 slabs and like I'm doing high balls. I'm like staying mentally sharp. And then I was doing like V2 and 3 slabs, and I did some like infamous kind of friction slab things. There's not that many slabs around Leavenworth, but after like maybe 5 or 6 climbing days, like I had a pretty solid circuit because when you're not climbing anything else, you just like walk up and do the slab a couple times and like walk to the next one, you know, so you really get in a good rhythm. And I actually climbed, I think my hardest slab boulder, maybe after like 2.5 or 3 weeks or something of slab climbing. So like not even a month after injuring my wrist, I had like basically PR'd in that
in
style.
This other area.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Which is like, that's definitely the fastest turnaround that I've ever had with an injury because my wrist was still like pretty jacked up at the time that I climbed that slab. Like I could down pull on holds with it like taped really tightly, but I couldn't deviate. I couldn't ulnar radial deviate. I couldn't pinch anything. I couldn't undercling anything. It was just like down pulling holds that were like right above my shoulder was like all I could really do. But the crazy thing about that story that didn't occur to me until later is that last fall, this is probably 7 or 8 months after the injury, I climbed Angelina Jolie, which is a V10 here, infamous V10. Just an amazing problem. It's like one of those problems that totally defies the grading scale because it's just so, it really all comes down to like one foothold, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I didn't realize this. I've been trying that problem for years, like almost 10 years, I think. And like kind of inching my way up, but mostly just getting a high point. And then, I'd like get a high point each season and have like 3 or 4 more days where I just got to that high point like 5 times a session. And you feel like you're good, you're doing well and you could do it, but you don't, And I kind of hiked it that fall. Like I went to it one day and I did really well on it. And I was like, I don't know if this is false confidence, but I actually think that I feel better on it. And then the next time I went, I think I sent it on my like second try of the day or first try of the day, maybe. But I realized in retrospect that my ability to maintain that pressure on that distant, tiny granite edge was exactly what I was practicing the previous spring when I was climbing all these like really hard edging slabs. And I don't know, I just think that that's kind of beautiful.
Yeah,
like
that's cool.
It's one of the best examples of, if you let them, your injuries are going to challenge you and they're going to hurt you, but they will also help you grow. It's just very hard to see how.
Totally.
When you're in the shit.
Mm-hmm.
But like now when I get injured, hopefully I have the forethought to be like, what good is going to come of this? Cross my fingers. I don't know if I'm that good, but.
No, totally. I want to share my own example of that because I think that is so cool. Like you always hear that, right? Like injuries are an opportunity. You can work on other weaknesses, but it's kind of hard to get buy-in when it's something like a finger and you're like, cool, well, I can't do anything directly climbing related. So how could this possibly make me much better? But when I was a few months into my pulley rehab, I'll talk more about this later, but I like did the initial rehab, got to a point where I could tolerate trad climbing. And it was like June at Smith Rock and Lower Gorge was still kind of in season and I'd missed the whole spring season. So I was just psyched to like do any kind of climbing. And I just kind of went on like a trad climbing rampage and like built a spreadsheet of all the routes I wanted to do and had all these like granite multi-pitches in Washington that I wanted to do and did some of those. And it was really fun. Like bought a bunch of gear and geeked out on gear and like really got into that. That was really cool. And I was also doing some, after probably 2 months of the initial rehab, I started doing some kettlebell training because I thought that would be like a nice way to regain general grip tolerance.
Yeah.
And I did the Simple and Sinister program for, I don't know, 6 weeks or something. And I'm just on-sighting like, I did like 50 new trad routes up to 11B, just like basically all on sites, nothing hard. I was climbing like 13. I think I'd climbed my first few 13Cs right before that. So these are like not hard climbs, and I didn't really see how that would help my climbing in any way.
Still, some of the 510s and 511s in the lower gorge.
The lower gorge is
some of those are hard
gnarly.
climbs.
Yeah, they are really. Yeah, that's a whole area that defies grades.
Maybe I'm just like a dumb boulder.
No. I feel the same way. Like they're like way too hard for the grades that they get. But it was crazy. Like I was, climbing low grades, doing some kettlebell training. And then as soon as I could tolerate sport climbing again, I had my best on-sighting season that I've ever had.
Yeah.
Did like my first 6 12C on-sights. Wow. Like in the course of the next month or something.
At Smith?
No, at Viento and TLC and some other Oregon areas that were like summer
cracks. 6
cracks.
12Cs at Smith is like legit.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever on-sighted a single 12C at Smith.
No, they're all 13A basically.
I've done some Bs, but yeah. And I like tried everything at Smith before I was like ready to on-sight it. But yeah, I mean, hugely helped my on-site climbing and never would have guessed that the trad climbing and the kettlebells would transfer to steep, overhung sport climbing on sites.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that transferred probably is like your confidence that you were building up, because you chose to do that kettlebell program thinking that it was going to help your grip rehab somehow. And that's a really important component. So like maybe the physical moves made you stronger, but in my opinion, it's just doing something to move yourself forward, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk a little more about my QL injury, I think later, but just getting right on the rehab train like as soon as possible and feeling like you're making some forward progress is just so important. And you can carry that forward really far.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you did. You went on that tear of on-sighting. You were probably feeling like super confident, super frosty. And, in the meantime, your fingers rehabbing, but that's not even what you were thinking about.
Right.
You're just thinking about like, damn, I'm up here killing it like over gear. And I just feel in this flow state, And I'm sure it's very natural to just take that back to where you thought you'd be.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that leads in really well to my next tip, which is to treat rehab like training and to know that rehab is really just what training looks like at the very low end of the training spectrum, depending on, of course, how serious your injury is and things like that. But to kind of illustrate that, I want to tell the whole story of that pulley injury rehab in case it helps someone out there. But I think if you listen to this process, you can kind of imagine how to apply this sort of thinking to any injury that you're recovering from. And I've told this story a million times on the podcast, so you can skip it if you've heard it before. But yeah, my first pulley injury, like I've been talking about, was spring of 2017. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on and to kind of pull back enough to really let it heal and then to start rehabbing. I might get into that later. But anyway, once I actually started rehabbing, I think I listened to that episode with Esther Smith, and I started just hanging from pockets, open 2-finger pockets, in it was a ring finger A2 pulley injury. I was hanging from middle 2 and from index and ring finger, front 2, just to try to balance out my grip training. Just doing 3 10-second hangs twice per week. That was all I did from May to June or July. I think by maybe June, probably started in April to June. And then in June, I kept doing those and kept progressing those, but I started adding the kettlebell stuff and started trad climbing, and had that amazing season. Once I could hang the 2-finger pockets with body weight plus 50 pounds added, with two hands.
I feel like that's more weight than I. Okay.
Yeah, I got to. Basically, I started out really, really light, way below. What was
and
physically hard for me, and got all the way back up to the strongest I'd ever been on pockets.
Yeah, for anyone who listened to the weight training episode, this is progressive overload in action.
Yes, exactly. Just did it like that, but then once I felt okay, my open grips are good, my pulley's got some structural integrity, I went all the way back down to super light loads, and I systematically trained my half crimp and my full crimp for the next 4 or 5 months. And I used the ladder program that I talked about in the last episode about finger training. I just did 2 rounds of that twice per week. I used that homemade sloth crimp I talked about, and I started out full crimping on a 1/2-inch edge, standing on the ground. I was standing on a bathroom, an analog bathroom scale that I got at Target or something. And I was only pulling 70 pounds with 2 hands, super, super light. And I just steadily progressed that all the way back up to body weight on that big edge, and then kept progressing it and downsized all the way to an 8mm edge. And by January, hit an all-time finger strength PR. And I think in September, I started sport climbing again, or August, and had all those onsights, climbed a few 13Bs. By November, I'd climbed my first 13D at Smith. And in January, hit that PR. So it just goes to show, rehab is training. And if you just do something systematic and consistent and really stick with it, you can go right from being injured all the way back up to the strongest you've ever been.
Yeah, sick. That's cool. My next tip, I think it just ties into everything we've been talking about. And I would phrase this as protect your identity, but it really is we've kind of covered a lot of the same sides of this shape, which is I think you said, experience your emotions and understand that it's going to be okay. And I guess my way of thinking about that is just understand that climbing is important to you if you're a climber. And that means that it's part of your identity, really, is the way that I think about that. I am a climber, I'm a lifer, and I know that that's part of who I am. And the reason it's so devastating when I get hurt, other than obviously the physical pain and not being able to do normal things without having pain, is just that loss of your normal schedule and your normal friends and your normal sensations that you have when you go outside. If you go for a hike in the park with your friends and there's a cool little boulder that has a crimp on it, that's exciting normally. But if you're injured, you see that, and all it does is just bounce you back to all those negative feelings and shit that you have about this injury that you're going through, right? And so it's the thing that you love the most has become electrified, and you can't touch it anymore, right? It's this third rail that you can no longer access. So I think figuring out how to form a good relationship with climbing while you come back from an injury is a really tricky thing. Obviously, if you can keep climbing in any way, like I talked about, I think that has to be the best method. If you can't do that, I think some things that have worked for me pretty well are to try to keep climbing in my life in some other context. So I have a partner who climbs, I have a lot of friends who climb, and I've learned that I think there's kind of two types of people. There's like people who would rather like lock themselves away and just not think about climbing at all and do something else until they're like done rehabbing. And then there's people like me where I just don't feel like I can do that. And so it's better for me actually to fully immerse myself in it, to go climbing, to be a pad caddy, to film people and like brush holds and try to bring positivity to that environment and just feed off of other people's energy. I mean, I think this is like part of why I became a coach, is because I actually really enjoy that part of the sport anyways. But when I'm injured, I just feel like that becomes like my full-time job, you know, is just like, what can I do to support my wife or to like show up for my friends? Or maybe I'll go like brush some boulders that I maybe will try to develop later, you know, just dig into some side of the sport. And then the other tip I think that's been really helpful for me, and you kind of mentioned, you know, that thing about like you want to learn French and you figure you'll do that when you pop your pulley, but then you pop your pulley and you don't. I do think if you have things that you're hoping to dive into that you've kind of been waiting on, if it's the type of injury where you can get over that hump and get yourself to do those things, it can be a really good time for that, right? Just because climbing takes up a lot of time. So when I sprained my QL, this is like super random, but I've been wanting to watch the show Deadwood forever. I just like don't watch that much TV. And I like finally made time to watch the show Deadwood, you know? It's like, I just don't get to like sit down and watch TV super often. And it's like a well-known show. And I just was excited to watch it. And I was like, well, fuck it. You know, I'm like laying down anyway. I'll watch this TV show, you know?
Yeah.
Caught up on some books that I've been meaning to read. Probably the biggest thing was like, for a solid 3 weeks there, I was cooking the most like nutritious, like actually planned out meals that I've cooked in like years. Because most of the time I'm like chicken, rice, steamed broccoli, you know, I'm on that like high speed cooking sort of train. So like to actually like put stuff together and like make peanut sauce or whatever, I was like, damn, I'm eating really good. Like it's going to suck when I recover fully from this injury.
Yeah.
That really helped me like feel like a human being, you know?
Yeah.
I actually am kind of missing like cooking real food. I should make myself a real meal.
No, I love all that. I fully agree with all that. I think that's really great advice. And it's interesting, like hearing you kind of say all that makes me reflect more on my first injury when I like had those things that I thought I wanted to do. And what I realize now is that I didn't actually want to do them. I just felt as though I should do those things or spend more time doing those things. So like, yeah, let yourself do things that you genuinely want to do.
Right.
Don't like, you're already, you know, miserable because you're injured. Don't like force yourself to do some chores that have been sitting on the back burner or something, you know?
Yeah.
If you want to do them and you feel like you have the energy, great. But
If you identify with the chores, if the chores are part of your identity, then.
So my fourth tip kind of builds on that. And it's speaking to the other half of people that you talked about, which is, which, you know, don't want to stay immersed in climbing or can't. And the tip is just to take a break from the climbing world if you feel like you need to. And it's been interesting for me. Like I've had very different experiences with different injuries. With that first pulley injury, I really thought that it was going to be a great opportunity to like give back more. I wanted to go out and like belay my friends, and I wanted to be supportive, and I wanted to kind of like make sure I was, you know, like balancing out my karma or something like that. Not because I'm superstitious, just because I wanted to like be a good guy and stay connected. But it was too hard for me at the time, at least for the first couple months. I was in probably like a darker place in my life in general. But yeah, I couldn't bring myself to keep doing that. I tried doing that, and belaying was hurting my finger a little bit, and I just felt frustrated, and I just didn't want to be there. And I kind of like got sucked into trying really easy routes at Smith, but there's no such thing as a finger-friendly route at Smith. Like it was just a bad idea, and I eventually just needed to fully walk away from climbing for a couple months, and that was really helpful for me.
Yeah, if you can't control yourself, like if you think you might do easy climbing, but that's not like a physically good idea yet, then yeah, it's probably best not to go to the crag at all.
Yeah.
Like if you're the type of person where you leave your shoes in the car so you won't climb and you borrow a pair of shoes, you know,
just don't go to the crag.
That's me.
Yeah. I used to be, and I think people change. Like I used to be more like that. And, a couple winters ago when I had that bicep injury in Waco, I was literally living at the campground, like at Leatherland, like I could see Waco constantly and it didn't bother me at all. And I enjoyed my days out and I hiked around and, I ended up picking some boulders to try that were bicep friendly. And that got me to like explore parts of Waco I'd never looked at before. And, had some really great hangs with friends and it was lovely. Like it was a pretty nice experience actually. So
this isn't a story of injury, but like when I went to South Africa, we went to a bookstore and got like a Birds of South Africa book and like a Mammals of South Africa book, and me and my wife both have like the Merlin bird watching app on our phone. And we love like looking at little bugs and like identifying plants and all that stuff. And all those things, like, I think those are cool things because they add richness to being a person who spends a lot of time outside. But they're super cool things when you're injured because there's just so much to do outside. You're in nature. It's like amazing, And if you can get into that stuff, I just feel like you just never run out of cool things to do when you're hanging out outside, Whereas if you're like just turbo focused on the climb and the crimps, like then it's going to be really hard to have a finger injury.
Yeah.
Especially your first one.
Yeah.
If your first injury is like a devastating full pulley tear, then you're probably going to go through a dark time. But the first one's the worst for sure.
Yeah. Because you don't know for sure that you can recover and that you're going to be okay. And then after you go through that, you're like, oh, the body's amazing. I can like trust this a little bit more.
I think climbing with some of those like super badass, like old guard in Bend who like had, told me that they'd like torn pulleys on like almost all of their fingers. And I'm watching them climb like 514s at Smith. And I was just like, okay, well, I guess that's like not that big of a deal when that happens. Like, did you go get any rehab? And they're like, no, I just kind of like kept climbing.
Right. I don't know why I didn't talk to more of those people.
Yeah. Are we moving on to pitfalls?
Yes, I'm ready for pitfalls. I've got 3.
I also have 3 pitfalls.
Okay. Let's keep the rotation going. It's your turn, I think.
Okay. My first pitfall, which probably beat to death already on the first tip, but pitfall number 1, seeing a medical pro who doesn't understand your sport or your identity. So I think we kind of got more into the details of this when we were covering my tip side of it, but I just think it's important to say again, like if you go too far down that road, you wind up in that situation where like it's been months and you have some chronic thing and you're still doing like, 2-pound dumbbell curls and like there's no progressive overload. So you're not adapting to it. And you're just like stuck with whatever this pain is. Like I think a lot of climbing rehab professionals understand that loading better, and they understand that when you have like a wrist tweak and you're a rock climber, like your forearm muscles are freaking strong, and your starting point for rehab is like probably pretty high. So that's a very easy kind of trap to get sucked into, and I think that's the actual pitfall that happens when you don't go see somebody who knows exactly what's going on. So. If you go to a doctor and they're like, stop climbing for 2 months and take some ibuprofen, like, get out of there.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I had a friend who's a really good climber back in college. And I remember at one point she was really frustrated with a shoulder, like a chronic shoulder injury. And she could not get any medical people to take her seriously because they're like, you're crushing all of our tests. Your shoulder seems fine. And she's like, no, you don't get it. It's like at 70%.
Right.
They just had never seen a climber before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the pitfall.
That's the pitfall. Yeah. There we go. And we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by Kaya. If you're anything like me, you probably love to travel and climb in new places. And one of the challenges I've faced when I was living on the road is managing an ever-growing pile of guidebooks. Climbers collect so many guidebooks and they're expensive. They get outdated as soon as new zones get developed. They take up precious space if you live in a van like I do. It's such a first world problem, but I think a lot of you can relate. Kaya is a great solution. Kaya is an app that gives you digital guidebooks for more than 100 top bouldering destinations in North America, with more being added to the app all the time. The folks at Kaya partner with local guidebook authors to make sure all of the areas and info are up to date. They get exact GPS coordinates of the boulders, detailed climbing area info and navigation, comprehensive topos, and thousands of beta videos, all downloadable for offline use. I have like 3 editions of some of my guidebooks, but with Kaya, your digital guidebooks get updated automatically as new info is released. You can also log your sends, follow what your friends are up to, post videos, and a lot more. I've been using Kaya for the past year or so. I'm super impressed with what these folks have built. The folks at Kaya are all real badass climbers. They understand what climbers need, and they just wanted to make a useful tool that's going to improve the climbing experience for all of us. Check out kayaclimb.com or download the Kaya app from the App Store to get started. And if you're already using the app, you can use my special link right there in the episode notes, or use code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off your first year of Kaya Pro. That's kayaclimb.com or the Kaya app, and use code NUGGET for 20% off your first year of Kaya Pro. This episode is brought to you by Rhino Skin Solutions. Rhino provides the best skincare products on the market for climbers, made from plant-based, great quality ingredients with no fillers and no BS. I've actually been following a pretty strict autoimmune paleo diet for several months now for health reasons, and I've found that my skin is actually better and I don't need to use as many skincare products, which is really interesting. However, Rhino is still my go-to when I need extra skin support. They make really high quality products, and they can be really helpful for folks who struggle with really any kind of skin issues. On the healing and repair side of things, they have Split and Split Plus if you have torn or cracked skin. It's really great for trad climbers if the backs of your hands are torn up and bloody. They also have Repair Cream, which is still the product that I use the most. Anytime my skin is super thin and I want to give it a little extra healing support, I'll apply Repair Cream multiple times in the evenings. They also have products for climbers with sweaty skin and climbers with really dry skin. Their antiperspirant products use non-toxic ingredients and can help keep your skin from sweating in warm conditions. And on the flip side, Rhino Spit is designed for climbers whose skin is too dry. One of my close friends has really dry skin and glassy skin, and she tends to dry fire a lot. She just blasts off of holds unexpectedly because her skin is too dry. And Rhino Spit has been a game changer for her. If you want to level up your skincare game, head over to rhinoskinsolutions.com and enter code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off your next order. That's rhinoskinsolutions.com. Use code NUGGET at checkout for 20% off and start taking better care of your skin today. And now, back to the show. Okay, my first pitfall is like if you have a new injury, testing it constantly or fucking with it all the time.
That's such a good one.
Like people do this with fingers. I do this with fingers or whatever, a wrist, a knee or whatever. You're like, does it hurt still? Is it still fucked up? Like, is it, maybe it's, and kind of going through that process of like, well, maybe it's kind of okay. It's okay if I do this. Like it feels better today. It's like, no, dude, it's injured. Just chill the fuck out. Let it chill. Let it rest. If you're just irritating it constantly and checking in on it like literally every hour, you're just dragging out the initial healing process.
Yeah. I think that's also like one potential downside of like ultra light constant loading rehab, which can be good for some injuries. But if it's something that could be like an irritant, or you're like you have a really sensitive injury, that type of loading where you're doing things like 3 times a day or 4 times a day, like it can also start to be a risk factor, especially if you're maybe like tolerating a little bit more pain during that exercise than you're supposed to.
Yeah.
Again, just to be super clear, I'm not a doctor. I've just experienced these things firsthand.
Totally.
So this is like my anecdotal experience. Like, I think you're right. I think get past the trauma phase, get past the initial pain, and do some loading that actually looks like training, right? And if your finger or whatever it is hurts during the loading, that's your sign that it's not ready for that load, right? But just like touching and prodding and like pulling on stuff like, 4 times a day is probably not.
I know it's really hard to articulate this. It's really hard to describe, but there is a sensation that's notably different when you're stimulating an injury and it's like the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do. It's really hard to describe what that is, but I learned that firsthand with that pulley injury. I dragged out the initial healing process. It could have been like 10 days probably. I think it was probably 6 weeks before I really started like rehabbing it properly. Maybe even longer. And it was because I was like, cool, I rested 3 days. I can start doing the little squeeze ball. I just started doing as much as I could possibly do right off the bat, and it didn't feel good, and it hadn't healed yet.
Right.
And in the end, I just kept irritating it. I kind of just like beat it like down lower and lower and lower until finally I was just at wit's end, and I just fully stopped doing everything for like 2 full weeks.
Yeah.
And it was, I remember it was like swollen, and I was like K-taping it to try to squeeze the inflammation out of it, and I was icing it, and I was like drinking cranberry juice and all this shit. And when push came to shove, I just needed to let it rest longer. And it really was like 10 days or 2 weeks for me of full rest before it finally like felt pretty good. And then when I loaded it, it like got sore, but in a way that felt satisfying. And then it felt better the next day. And I was like, oh, that's how it's supposed to feel.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
it's okay.
There's pain and there's damage, right? And we so strongly connect those two things, especially I feel like especially in like American culture. It's like if you're in pain, something is wrong and it needs to be fixed. But like pain is just pain, and we can like take that and set that over there. And then there's also damage. Sometimes when you have pain, it's because there's damage. Not always. If you just had trauma to your finger, then yeah, you probably need to wait a little while and let the tissue like begin the healing process, get some of that damage out of there, and then you can start loading it. And when you start loading it, you may experience some pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's still damaged. And this is like tricky to understand. You're right that there are some sensations kind of inherent to dealing with an injury that it just comes with the benefit of having been injured a whole bunch of times. You start to understand what that sensation feels like.
Yeah.
The magic of that is that it makes it easier to get back into loading sooner, because you just gain a confidence where you're like, yeah, this shit hurts right now, but I actually feel like I could do this and it'll be okay. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in another one of my pitfalls.
Nice.
Yeah. Anything else on that?
Just that with the pulley, just because this took me a stupid long time to understand, and maybe nowadays like people just know all this stuff. I have no idea, but it took a long time. It took like the 10 days or 2 weeks for the scar tissue to heal over the torn area, and the inflammation and the swelling did naturally just go away when I gave it enough time. And I don't think trying to rush that process is very smart, because the body's just doing its natural healing thing. And then once the scar tissue's there, then you can start remodeling it. And then as you load it, you're bringing in like, all these little healing things in your body, and it's going to strengthen that tissue, but it's okay to let your body just do its natural thing for a while.
Right.
And that, I thought I had to start I thought if I didn't jump on the rehab right away, then I was going to get this worthless scar tissue that wasn't going to be strong.
Yeah.
But you can let that happen first, and then you can remodel it and strengthen it.
And especially with a finger, I mean, like if you're a fan of evolution, like there's a natural history theory to rehabilitation, right? And if you're a fan of evolution, you can kind of look at what we would have been doing in our evolutionary history. Like we weren't voodoo flossing our fingers or like making sure that we were progressively over. Like that's all nuance. Like we were probably swinging around on trees or like grasping objects and like hitting animals over the head with clubs or whatever the fuck cavemen did, right? And like all of that grasping would have rehabilitated a finger injury if somebody had gotten one at that time, right? You don't necessarily, would that finger have been like in tip-top shape for a caveman climber athlete? No, probably not. And that's, I think, what you're looking for with that progressive overload is to get back to sport faster and to hopefully like hit a new PR 7 months later or whatever. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't recover from the injury by just going about your life. And I think people kind of underestimate the power of that. In fact, ironically, my next pitfall is ignoring it for too long. But one of the first things I wanted to talk about in this pitfall is how many things can self-resolve if you just give them a chance. Like
that's a really good one that hits.
It's both parts of that sentence are very important, right?
Yeah.
Most little tweaks and twinges that you run into, things that are not like trauma, not like something went wrong on the wall with the loading or you fell weird or whatever, but just like, you kind of feel a little weird after a session. So much of that stuff will go away if you make space for it to go away. If you're back in the gym the next day, you're kind of doing it to yourself, like you sort of deserve it a little bit.
Yeah.
It's tricky because if you ignore it for too long, that's how you wind up with chronic injuries. And at least in my experience, I hope nobody ever has to make this decision. But if you ask me, if I had to choose between like a traumatic injury and a chronic injury, like that's going to be a tough choice. I would want to know what the injuries were. But most of my traumatic injuries have been easier to recover from because the chronic ones, I just kind of am ignoring it for a little bit too long. And by the time I realize it's actually a problem, it is a full-blown problem. And with the traumatic injury, it's this sudden thing, and it takes a lot of effort to like get over it and figure out what to do and deal with the identity piece and the emotional piece. But then once you kind of get in the groove, you just keep training and keep making your stuff heavier, and then eventually you're just really strong again.
Yeah.
With the chronic stuff, it's kind of like, how much do I have to stop climbing?
Totally.
Can I climb 2 days a week? Oops, I went too hard.
Yeah.
Like, okay, now I'm feeling pretty good. Maybe I'll add a third day. Okay, I'm going for a couple weeks. Everything's fine. Wow, I haven't felt that injury in a little while. Maybe I'll just, I'll just keep hanging out on the moon board for like, oh, oops, there it goes. It's just like, they're like these time bombs, basically. So I think some things I like to pay attention to are if you feel the same pain consistently during the session, like you've warmed up, you're moving well, you've been climbing, and that pain shows up, and you feel that pain consistently session to session, like for more than a couple weeks, that's probably something to think about dealing with. If you feel pain a couple days after the sessions consistently in the same place, and I'm not talking like discomfort or sore muscles, I'm talking like pain, and you feel that for a few weeks, that might be something you want to pay attention to. And those things that I'm talking about can still be things that self-resolve if you give them space. But if you're the type of person who's going to keep climbing 2 or 3 days a week, or you're going to keep going out to your project 2 or 3 days a week, you want to know that about yourself.
Yeah.
I definitely know that about myself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, same.
I'm always blown away when I stop doing something, how much better certain parts of my body feel. So like, I'll give you an example. I was on this Southwest trip for a chunk of spring. And while I was on that trip, I had like structured a little bit of my coaching so that I would be doing less work while I was there, right? So I was just like, it was like 2 days less, 2 days where I wasn't at the computer. So I was still working like 3 days a week, basically, and even still using the computer on the other days. But I wasn't using my mechanical keyboard that I have at home, which is like slightly harder. And I was like, wow, my knuckles are like a little bit less swollen than they usually are, even while I was in Bishop crimping all the time. And then I came home and started typing again. And within like a couple weeks, my sore, swollen knuckles had come back.
Wow.
I don't know if I just type really hard or what, but that's just an example of something where it's like, I just don't notice. It's just like background noise, And then when you stop doing whatever it is that's aggravating that thing or causing that issue, like I think my body is just keeping a lot of fluid in my knuckles because there's just a little inflammation there. Take that stimulus away, the thing goes away. But I've noticed the same thing with like, if I stop climbing, I have like the stiffness in my upper back where I injured it a long time ago just kind of goes away. Like if I didn't want to climb, I could not have pain in my upper back, or I'd have less pain in my upper back probably for like most of my life, right? But I want to climb, so I deal with that feeling. And then same thing with my wrist injury. It's like if I just avoid underclings and avoid certain Gastons, I'll have no wrist pain, right? But I want to undercling stuff, and I want to Gaston stuff. So sometimes I'm going to have wrist pain. It's just all about the context of the pain, right? And just becoming kind of familiar with it and what it feels like, and understanding when you need to make a decision to deal with it. Yeah.
Giving it a chance. That really hit me. And that's something I became aware of a few years ago, is that, wow, it's so simple. And I've like screwed this up so many times. It's going to sound so obvious saying this out loud, but I've definitely had the mindset for way too many years. For instance, I'd be either in a training block or like in peak climbing season with good weather. And I'd be like, oh, I'm starting to feel like some elbow tendonitis or some tweaky finger thing or some this or some that or whatever. I hope I make it to the end before this becomes
it's a race.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like, I hope I make it to my deload week, or I hope I make it to the end of the program, or I hope I make it to June when the weather gets hot and I can stop trying. And I think it was 2021 that summer. I was working with Steve Maish and I was doing this training program, and I was doing some like weighted bouldering. I was like using a 10-pound weight vest for some of my bouldering, or weight belt. And, like built up the volume and had like my heaviest week. And I remember like going through that week and feeling kind of sketchy, like, oh God, this feels bad. I'm like kind of worried that I was like kind of concerned that I'd injured myself, basically. Like my fingers felt creaky. I just didn't feel good. And then, luckily we'd kind of planned things right, and I had a deload week right after that. And then I just realized like I probably went a little too aggro with this weight belt and like added it to too many of my climbs. I had the deload week. I was totally fine after that. I was like, wow, that was so fucking simple. I just needed to go easy for 1 week and then I was fine.
Yeah.
It was crazy, but I've not done that so many times. And then it's led to a chronic issue.
I think it's like one of the most impressive skills that a climber can demonstrate to me is an ability to stop or hold back when things are going extremely well. I think it's just, there are blessings and curses with climbing being a lifelong sport. And I think one of the curses that you get with climbing being a lifelong sport is a short-term attitude about what you can accomplish this season can be like destructive to what you can accomplish in the long run if you're not careful. And I've done exactly the same thing that you're talking about. My last bullet point on the ignoring it pitfall was just, I love this quote. I don't know where this came from, but Dave McLeod is where I heard it. One definition of an athlete is an unreasonable bastard. And I just feel like that so well summarizes the way that I think about like pain and injury when I'm going through a season and I'm like really close to sending something. Sometimes you need to listen to that signal and you need to deal with it. You need to take a deload week, or you need to just not try the project and go try something else for a day. Or just, this is a crazy idea to a lot of people, I know. And I myself have a very hard time implementing it. You can just rest for like 3 days and you'll feel good.
Or 5 days.
Or 5 days.
Like, especially as you get older and you have like a really big base of climbing skill. I remember I tweaked my wrist the session before I did the practitioner, and it had been kind of a recurring injury. And I like almost stuck that final move, and like my wrist kind of popped out and it hurt so bad. I took 5 full rest days. Didn't do anything. No fingerboarding, nothing.
Nice.
Just worked on podcasts.
Nice.
And then went out there. I guess it was not the one before. It was 2 sessions before I sent, because I went back out there, went back to the boulder. It was a little wet, so I kind of had like a half session where I just refreshed the moves, came back the next day and did it.
Sick.
I was like, I just needed 5 days off.
Yeah.
And my wrist is okay.
Yeah, that's money.
Yeah. Cool. Pitfall number 2 for me is thinking of yourself as fragile or prone to re-injury after an injury. That sounds a little weird, but what I mean by that is I think it's a pitfall to avoid doing the thing that got you injured in the first place forever. It's way better in my mind. I mean, there's exceptions to this, but like it's way better to ask yourself, what do I need to do to make sure this will never happen again? And then do that. And the example that I always use for this is years ago at Smith, and this was when I got that pulley injury. I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was really struggling with the injury. I was trying to like figure out if it was going to be okay, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh yeah, I had one of those years ago. I just don't crimp anymore. And I was like, that is unacceptable for me.
Yeah, that's like 50% of all holds.
Exactly. Like you just accepted that you're never going to crimp again. Like you climb at fucking Smith.
Oh, yeah.
What are you going to do? And, to each their own. But I think that's, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, that's just kind of like irrational thinking. It's just kind of avoidant thinking. And there is a way to prevent the thing that happened. Like unless it was, a freak accident or like a weird fall or something like that. But if you got like a heel hook injury or a finger or a wrist or whatever, there's very likely something you can do in your rehab to make it way stronger than it's ever been so that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Yep. The one that springs to mind for me, this is the other thing that came out of my wrist injury, I guess. They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. I did all that slab practice and I sent Angelina Jolie, but I injured my wrist on a problem called Thunderdome Low. It's a V11 in Leavenworth. I think you've been trying it this season. Yeah. So it's like a pretty tough boulder.
Yeah. It's a hard 11.
And hard on the wrist, that if you do that flip beta. And I went back and did it the fall after I injured my wrist on it. It was like very important to me actually that be like one of the first things that I went back to do.
And you intentionally did it the same way.
Exact same beta.
I remember that.
Yeah, I did not let myself use like any, there's like knee bars and toe hooks and stuff now. And I was like, no, I'm going to do this the hard way.
Nice.
I'm pretty happy about that actually.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's sick.
Yeah. Yeah, the wrist injury all around for me is just going to be like the one where I'm like, yeah, nailed that one. All the other injuries I just am not going to worry about as much. But there is one other one I want to talk about. So my last pitfall for the day is just being negative in general. I know that some people thrive on different levels of like positivity and negativity, but when it comes to injuries in particular, I think the way you think and the way you talk about your injuries and your fragileness, to connect to what you said, those things do impact your recovery. And I don't mean that metaphysically. I mean, like, if you feel less confident, then you'll take a little bit less risk. You'll do a little bit less rehab. You'll go climbing a little bit later. And that stuff all stacks up to make it take longer for you to get better or to not reach as high of a peak when you do get better, right? You don't have to be like relentlessly sunshine and bluebirds or whatever, right? Like, it's okay to be negative. Like you said, you can feel your feelings. That's totally fine. I think the important thing is to be optimistic about the idea that you can heal.
Yeah.
And that there is some other future out there.
And you can be really bummed and like own those feelings and talk about your injury in a way that's optimistic and hopeful.
Yeah. I think the majority of this podcast has been colored by the fact that neither you or I have had like a grievous injury.
Yeah.
Right. But I know personally some climbers. I mean, I know like a really badass alpinist who fell basically free soloing, 50 plus feet in the lower gorge and like broke his legs and broke his back. And he was just up here a couple of weeks ago, like bouldering around and did a bunch of sport climbing and index and is like onsighting hard routes and he did a bunch of crazy shit on Mount Hood. And it's mind boggling what the body can recover from if you let it, right? I know, and you asked me at the beginning of the show, like, I know I have a tendency with most of my injuries to think that it's over and that's it. And I'm like, I have to retire from hard climbing, right? But like, often I'm not only back to where I was, but I'm even better. I'm feeling even better than I was before on a much shorter timeline than I expected. So like I did this thing to my back. I initially thought it wasn't a big deal. I ignored it. That was bad. I re-injured it. And that re-injury was actually like pretty bad. And then I had all the downtime that I talked about earlier. But by the point that I got to being able to load it every day, even just like doing planks, I was doing like isometric push-ups. I started doing a little bit of hanging, getting some traction. And then as soon as I was like, I think I could do some very basic weight training, I went to Tyler Nelson, I got a rehab plan, and I started doing it exactly as written 2 days a week. And I started at body weight or like very low weight for everything, but I progressively overloaded everything. And then as I got better and better, I think I've been doing that for like 7 or 8 weeks now. As I got better and better, I upgraded the exercises to be more intense or to be more off balance, because I think that part of the reason I injured my QL is because like a lot of my training has been bilateral for like quite a long time. I just haven't been doing that much unilateral stuff. And my back kind of tends to laterally flex more one way than the other way, my lumbar, because I have scoliosis. So I just like made a lot of my training reflect those things that I thought maybe were affecting me and caused me to injure my QL. And I feel like a beast. I mean, I mashed my PB flash like a few weeks ago at the end of the season. And I've climbed on your board, I think 3 times, but I feel just as strong as I've ever felt on a board.
That's
like,
awesome.
At 40 or 45.
You're looking really strong on
like,
this thing.
My injury exposed a weakness. I attacked both the injury and the weakness head on. I treated my rehab like training, which you talked about earlier. And now that weakness feels like a strength. And soon maybe it'll be a superpower. It's I don't think it's always going to be that much of a storybook, but it can be. And it takes volition on your part. It takes like action on your part in order to make it happen like that.
Yeah, totally. Love it. Okay, my last one. It's nothing new. It's nothing surprising, but it's not easy to do. My pitfall number 3 is trying to rush the process. So tempting because you just want to be better and you want to be back to climbing, and it sucks. It's okay that it sucks. But yeah, just trying to have that mindset that it's going to take what it takes. and that you can be diligent and focus on rehab and rest and recovery and nutrition and all the things that you feel motivated to do. You don't have to obsess over those things, but if you are one of those kind of like type A antsy people that wants to be doing more and more and more, focus your energy in those areas, not on the maximum amount of rehab you can do. But yeah, don't try to rush it or find shortcuts. Just let it do its thing. Just let your body do its thing. And it's a miracle. It's magic, like the way that the body can bounce back. So yeah, it goes all the way back to my first tip. Know that it's going to be okay. Give it the time it needs.
Yeah.
And be patient.
Yeah. Bonus tip. Upper body injury, walk a lot. Lower body injury, pull-ups.
Mic drop. All right. Is that everything?
That's it.
Okay. Thanks for listening, everybody. We hope that you're listening to this and you're healthy and you're just curious and you're trying to prepare yourself in the case that you ever do get injured. But if you are injured, it's going to be okay. We hope this has been helpful. Reach out if you have any questions or thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Best of luck with your rehab and recovery, and we will see you in the final episode.
Bye-bye.